Welcome back to Pentagram Prime, everybody. I flew a mission in KSP recently, and it was a morale mission designed to encourage a very special 6-year-old, my niece, to do her math homework and grow up to be an astronaut or at least attend the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School. Either one works. Anyhow, I had hours of video sitting on my hard drive that I couldn't show to the aforementioned child because at this stage in the game, it would just put her to sleep and do so long before her scheduled bedtime. So basically, I'm following a design for a space station laid out by a channel called Orbiter, link in the description. I've long since lost interest in playing career mode. I mean, I get it, how you get a sense of accomplishment by doing all the science experiments and completing the missions, but it's just not for me. Really, I just want to be able to learn the game well enough so that I could build something when I feel the need to, and so far, just following tutorials and using sandbox mode is good enough for me to make some progress in the game. So this is part 2 of that tutorial, and I am constructing the refueler module, which is basically a large fuel tank that also has room for some RCS propellant. Disclaimer, this is not a tutorial by itself. Yes, I'm going to talk about what I'm doing, and I'll probably give my impressions on best practices, but it's not structured or fact-checked the way I would want to do a tutorial either. Try to file this under an essay where I talk about what I did with my weekend. If anyone has any specific questions about the build, you can reach me in the comments. Chances are I'll probably refer you to Orbiter. The rocket I used was already constructed prior to this build. I did have to switch out the second stage engine in order to deal with the larger payload. The one thing I did not see in the Orbiter tutorial was a reference to modifications to the fuel flow between the boosters and the main tank. I kind of had to figure that out on my own. It's pretty simple. Just make sure that you don't have fuel flowing out of the main tank and into the boosters, or else they'll never run out of fuel and they'll keep on running as you're staging and trying to jettison them. The rocket is rather top heavy, so gravity turns need to be done slowly. If you're like me, you try to use this launch as an opportunity to make your launches more efficient. But despite my best efforts, I always had to dip into the fuel and the payload in order to get to the station and to have enough fuel left to deorbit the second stage booster. So this must be the 10th or 15th time that I launched using the revert to launch feature and going back and trying to learn from my mistakes. The initial flight actually went quite well, as my only goal was to avoid tipping the vehicle over. I used Kerbal Flight Engineer, of course, and this was useful since it allows you to see your apoapsis, periapsis, and distance to target all in one place. And those figures are the reason I spent so many flights trying to find ways to get to where I was going without burning up more fuel than it was needed. At booster separation, I did something that feels a little bit like a cheat. As soon as the tanks on the boosters were empty, I quickly shut off the throttle, staged the boosters, and turned the gas back on again in order to move the rocket away from the 4 now separated first stage boosters. I've had numerous flights where the boosters continued to fire after I separated them. I'm sure there is a more efficient way around this, but I was too busy to go look it up. I know, I'm a bad uncle for not teaching my niece and nephew proper staging. As I mentioned earlier, I'm taking the gravity turn slowly so that the payload doesn't prematurely fall back to Earth or cause the rocket to spin. So the goal will be a stable orbit below that of the space station, which is flying ahead of us while we fly east, as you can see on the nav ball. By doing this, we will catch up to the station and tweak our orbit as we get closer. What we don't want to do is let our orbit get higher than the space station, or else it will begin to move away from us. Also, you'll eventually have to carry out another engine burn just to lower your orbit. First stage burnout, and our apoapsis looks good at 70 kilometers. I shut the second stage off here because 70 kilometers is good enough for a stable orbit. We'll lose some of that to air resistance, but that will go away shortly, and our primary goal now is to raise the periapsis without causing the apoapsis to go above 100 kilometers, the space station's approximate orbit. Manual deployment of the fairing, and we're about a minute away from hitting our apoapsis point. It's important to time the burn so that you do half before and half after the given T-minus point. However, for such a large burn, I found that it's easier to get close to the apoapsis and burn prograde just until the apoapsis starts to move a sizable amount away from you. There's some trial and error involved in this process, but if you started firing your second stage engine 1 minute away from apoapsis, and just as you were waiting for the periapsis to rise, you see that the apoapsis is now 5 minutes away instead of 1, I would cut the throttle and wait until I was within a minute of it. It's also important to note that your velocity is parallel to the planet as you pass through the apoapsis point. So by only firing at or near this point, you refrain from wasting fuel on raising or lowering your apoapsis when your goal is to be modifying your periapsis. I'd also like to take a moment to say that this is not a proper lesson, kind of throwing this thing together last minute. So if you don't know what apoapsis and periapsis mean or who Jeb and Val are, then you may just want to go and talk to Scott Manley. Anyways, thanks for listening. Speaking of Scott Manley, I was watching one of his videos recently and an ad came up for this, not sure how to describe her in polite terms. Well, she's not really designed to do anything except exhibit a reaction from men such as myself, and I'm getting sick of seeing her. Now, I want to be clear that I am a depraved human being. And if the worst thing about me was having a relationship with a third-rate artificial intelligence while having to wash one of my peripheral devices in the bathroom sink, I would actually consider that an improvement. The problem is I'm not interested. And I doubt that I'll ever be interested in any sort of weird avatar looking at me with dead eyes every time I click on a video. Not necessarily Scott Manley's, by the way. This is starting to feel a little bit insulting. I mean, when the day comes that Starbucks is delivering triple tall mochas to my doorstep with a mobile van that's got a espresso machine and a milk steamer installed in it, that's something I might be able to warm up to. Granted, the drinks are probably going to be $20 a pop. But that's better than asking me over and over if I need a girlfriend that lives in the land of Tron. All right, rant's over. Where was I? I burned the engine, but it's because I accidentally hit the shift key. Don't do that. So now I'm firing the engine as I do something similar to an instrument scan that a pilot would do on final approach. I need the periapsis to continue decreasing, but simultaneously I need the apoapsis to stay the same, and I need to watch the altitude to ensure that I'm not past apoapsis, careening back in towards the atmosphere. Also, if you're in map mode and you see that you're decelerating even though you're not firing your engine retrograde, chances are you're already dead because your vehicle is being superheated by the atmosphere. So looking good at about 48 seconds from apoapsis. I should be clear, however, that this is a figure that indicates how long we have until we get to apoapsis if we're not accelerating. When the engine fires, these figures are subject to change. And going back to the subject of death by hypersonic flow, I'm now back to looking directly at my spaceship so that I know it is alive and well. This is another reason to employ mods like Kerbal Engineer because they allow you to keep an eye on all of the numbers regardless of whether or not you're in map mode at the time. Just killed the engine because I noticed my apoapsis starting to spike up to about 77 kilometers. I'm going to wait until I get a little bit closer before firing again. About 22 seconds looks good, and a short burn before our time to apoapsis starts to rise again. Also, I'm manually keeping my nav ball aligned here. I forgot why I chose to do this, but you can just click on the prograde icon and SAS will do it for you automatically. Burn again after waiting till 10 seconds of apoapsis this time, and we see us pushing the periapsis figure further out of that negative 300 kilometer hole that it's still in while leaving the apoapsis mostly unchanged. This can get a bit nerve-wracking since you're not actually in orbit and yet you have to start and stop the engine rather than just getting into a stable orbit in one burn. But saving gas is both good for the environment as well as the Kerbals that live in our imaginations. Killing the engine again now that time to apoapsis is back up to 20 seconds. And less than 10 seconds from apoapsis, I remember to click on the prograde marker in SAS before firing the second stage. So I just passed the apoapsis point, and I want to be careful here, trying to get us a bird's eye view of the orbit that is not yet fully formed. This seems to be where I've historically thrown my orbit way off after an otherwise perfect launch. And now that the orbit is close to being circular, you may have to wait a little bit longer between engine firings if you want an efficient raising of your orbit. So we burn a little bit more in order to ensure that our next stop is not inside the atmosphere. And now stable at an altitude hovering around 80 kilometers, I prefer to disable the engine. The shift key increases your throttle, and there's nothing quite like ruining a mission because you screenshotted it using Command Shift 3 for you MacBook users out there. And then 5 minutes later, you realize that you had the engines running the whole time, and now you're about to deorbit because you're a fucking idiot. So, about 6 minutes to periapsis, and we're going to time warp to that point. Gameplay is much more leisurely at this point, since I'm no longer thinking about how long I have until I re-enter the atmosphere. Reactivating the second stage, and I'm not going to open the throttle all the way. I'm just going to let the fuel trickle in as I watch how the periapsis, which should remain relatively stable, and the apoapsis, which should begin to rise, behave as I do this. A 95 kilometer apoapsis is good enough for now. From here, I deactivate the engine and get ready to warp to the apoapsis, where I will do another prograde burn in order to raise the periapsis from 75 kilometers up to 95. We're going to skip past that burn and move on to something more interesting. Now that we have a roughly circular orbit at 95 kilometers and we're getting closer to the station, we can do that thing that puts you into the same orbital plane. I almost want to say that it's a circularization burn, but that's not quite right. Anyway, you were warned that this is not really a tutorial, and I can't afford the insurance for that sort of thing anyway. So this is where I'm actually going to use a maneuver node so that I can get an idea of how the orbital planes match up when I burn normal or anti-normal. In this case, I'll be orienting via the maneuver node, which in this case is pointing normal. And as you can see, the craft is pointing perpendicular to its path of movement. There's the burn, a very gentle one at 34 seconds to periapsis. And what we're focusing on is the relative inclination under the rendezvous box of the Flight Engineer mod. Once the burn is complete, relative inclination should be 0, and as the burn proceeds, you should be able to see the yellow and blue paths begin to line up. Now, this correction can be done later when you get closer to target. However, depending on when and how that happens, it will probably be more efficient to line up the respective apoapsis and periapsis nodes and conduct the normal anti-normal burns as necessary at either of those points. This will help with avoiding large last-minute burns necessary to cancel out a chunk of velocity that you wouldn't otherwise have if you'd done the correct incremental burns along the way. At this point, I'm trying to follow both the delta V / maneuver node indicator and the relative inclination. Now you can just burn blindly until the specified amount of speed has changed hands. However, the maneuver nodes are not exact, and I find that it's best to remain vigilant. And it's been a couple of days since I recorded this, but I'm going to guess that I stopped the burn with 16.5 left on the meter because my apoapsis was starting to rise. In the interest of time management, I'm trying to stay about 5 kilometers below the station orbit so that I don't need as many orbits in order to catch up. If you're in a lower orbit, then you move around the planet faster than the vehicle in the higher orbit. Delete the maneuver node, and now it's a waiting game as we allow orbital mechanics to close the 390 something kilometer gap between us and the space station. Pausing my time warp to let my ship orient itself in anticipation of a prograde burn. And 51 kilometers from my target while seated near my apoapsis, I think I forgot that my engine was already set to active. Now I'm going to do some gentle burns to raise the periapsis. And I do mean gentle. You can always add more, but most of the rules of thermodynamics apply in this game, and if you accidentally burn all of your gas or impart a sizable amount of momentum, that you later realize you didn't need, then it's hard to simply put it all back. Unless, of course, you edit the save file, in which case you're playing God. And shut the engine off, because if I'm going to play with fire, then I want it to be because I meant to do so. About 30-something kilometers out, and I'm chasing the target indicator with my cursor until finally it shows me a distance somewhere in the mid-20s. Backing out of time warp because I think we are almost to our closest approach, at least at this orbit. And survey says 19.8, we can do better than that. 12.1, better, but I like to think we could get within a kilometer before we have to burn towards the target. About 21 seconds from apoapsis, about 3.5 minutes to our current closest approach to target, and we're going to set up for another prograde burn to get us just a bit higher without going above the orbit of the space station. And that goes to show that it doesn't take much to raise your orbit by 1 kilometer when you're already up about 100 kilometers. Now I'm confused because it's my periapsis that I thought would increase, but I seem to have done that backwards. If someone wants to tell me how I got that wrong, please feel free to tell me in the comments, if anyone's even watching this. I wasn't drunk, but I was a bit sleep deprived during some of these maneuvers. FYI, I love feedback, but if you are the Unabomber, and believe it or not, I got a message from some troll who fit that description, and all you want to do is shoot your mouth off, then take your business elsewhere, please. Next close approach is 11.8 kilometers, and I'm sipping as much coffee as I need in order to remain patient at this point. You know, I was so relieved when someone developed a zero-G coffee mug a few years back because I really don't know how I would handle a real-life docking maneuver without one. I'll have to look it up again. It's 3D printed, I think, and it works on capillary action. 5.9 kilometers to our next closest approach, and hey, when I changed my orbital inclination, were my apoapsis and periapses aligned with that of the station? Now that I think about it, I'm not sure that they were. Oh well, we're well on our way and it's all good. I can already smell the Kerbal space pizza that Jeb has cooking for me in the science module. A lot of time spent fussing over these trajectories. I go running in my spare time, and if you're not careful, you can get some really nasty sores from the friction that builds up over the course of roughly 10 miles or so when you're outside. And I do rage against the stereotype of the gamer that never leaves their couch, let alone their apartment. Unfortunately, after you finish screaming in the shower as the result of a combination of sweat, which is loaded with salt, and then hot, soapy water running over your irritated skin, you run into another problem when you're preparing to sit down for the rest of the day and relax with Kerbal Space Program. You can't sit. But Planet Kerbin depends on players like me, and I'm counting on my obsession, though however misguided, to help motivate kids like my niece and nephew to learn trigonometry because it's just so badass. Football is going out of style due to brain injury, and I'm crossing my fingers that the Holy Trinity, that being of math, physics, and chemistry, will be the new status symbol by the time they finish high school. Or maybe we'll all be plugged into the Matrix by then, and people won't be using apps anymore to find love. They'll just be dating the apps themselves. Maybe the apps will become sentient, and we'll all have to learn how to make out in Python. I don't think I could ever really get into that, and I weep for the future. What was I talking about? Where am I? Oh yeah, coming up on our close approach of 5.9 kilometers, activating engines, a couple of short bursts, and both our apoapsis and periapsis are around 98 kilometers. Oh yeah, coming up on a close approach of 5.9 kilometers, activating engine, a couple of short bursts, and both our AMP are around 98 kilometers. I remember AMP. It was a chain of convenience stores back in New England, I think. God, this is tedious. Can't stay on the ball. It's alright. It's just a game. Shut down the engine and cruise. Hey, wait, did my separation distance just go up to 6 kilometers? Hope it's still trending downward. Nope, I obviously made a wrong turn at Albuquerque. I think it's time to kill our relative velocity and burn back towards that space pizza that I've been dreaming of. was 24 meters per second between two craft at 9 kilometers separation. Hopefully not a huge fuel bill. We will soon see. And the empty gas tank means it's time to cheat and borrow from the payload that I swore to deliver intact. I could try to use the RCS at this point, but I really want to save that for later when I'm closer to the target. Open valves and skimming the register because it was the only way to make rent. I'm actually not sure if it was or was not Orbiter's intention that I get the entire tank to the station without having to dip into it. I'm now reminded that when I last looked up the plans for SpaceX's Starship, it wasn't forecasted to simply be one ship with one refueling tanker and then boom off to the moon and Mars. I think it was actually going to be multiple launches of the tanker in order to get the fuel fully stocked up on the target vehicle. Anyways, looking forward to seeing how that works out. There was more than a little bit of guesswork here because I had yet to sit down with a pencil and paper and properly work out how much fuel I would need left over in order to reliably deorbit the second stage upon discarding it. It's yet another project I'll get around to when I'm not managing 3 million other projects, including a refresher course that I want to take on complex analysis. Neutralizing the last of the relative velocity as I chase the retrograde indicator on my nav ball. Oops. Don't think I was supposed to hit the gas like that. And I'm now moving away to the tune of 3 meters per second. This is where using SAS to reorient your craft over and over again becomes agonizing. In extreme cases, I look for ways to pass the time as the nav ball slowly goes back and forth. It's enough to make you seasick as you wonder if your fuel will run out while you curse every increase in relative velocity as well as every decrease in your fuel load. You hear about the other kids on your block that have already docked with their toy space stations, and then you become self-conscious for a moment before you relax and realize that you're actually a middle-aged man and that it's no longer 1989. So, at 4.9 miles to target, I realized that SAS was completely saturated, and I finally broke out the RCS thrusters for attitude control. Even in hindsight, it hurts for me to watch me use up a quarter tank of my RCS fuel. Jebediah Kerman probably already ate my pizza. And just firing the engine in order to get my velocity to line up. We're looking good for a close approach inside of 2 kilometers. Carefully deleting my relative velocity at 1.9 kilometer separation. And we're down to the nitty-gritty here. When I started writing the script for this episode, I told myself that from here on out, I should make a video about each KSP mission that I fly. However, there is no way in hell I'm going back next time and adding in the comments and narrating this thing after the fact. Otherwise, I really won't leave my couch. I'm just going to have to get better at talking as I play. Still, I do aspire to build more stuff in this medium, and I see no reason not to turn it into content for the channel, especially since it complements my interest in math. I just have to make sure that the sores on my butt are still from running and not from sitting in my living room for 16 plus hours a day as I live off of coffee and fig bars. We're 1.6 kilometers out, and this should be my last primary retrograde burn, now that everything is lined up and I'm relatively close to the target. Intercept at 0.7 kilometers, and I just have to stay focused on the retrograde marker. You know, even after I finished my degree in physics, I'm pretty sure it was about a year before I realized that if you throw a baseball from a space station and you do it in the direction of Earth, it doesn't actually fall back to Earth. By all credible accounts, you might actually, on a long enough timeline, see it coming back up at you if atmospheric drag doesn't get to it first. Just the weird, non-intuitive things that you only get with some instruction on orbital mechanics, a class that I actually never took. And such is the case here. Even though my velocity started out going towards the space station, it has now drifted as we move about the planet. And I think this is where I realized that I was already at my closest approach, or close to it, since Flight Engineer is now telling me that I am 502 meters to target, and yet the intersect marker in map mode is telling me to wait for what is actually a larger distance. So I'm canceling the velocity again. You can begin to make out the structure of the station now, and I'm resisting the urge to activate RCS so I can properly align myself sometime before the end of the Capitol Hill organized protests, the Trump presidency, or the stranglehold that police unions now have in our country. Actually, I'm good with the end of police unions beating me to proper alignment because they needed to be reined in years ago. Velocity zeroed out, and I need to close the distance before the reality of orbital mechanics rears its ugly head on my flying gas can. 1 meter per second should do us. Point retrograde before I warp and pray to the nav ball that we might find salvation at the docking port. Is anybody here a fan of Close Encounters of the Third Kind with Richard Dreyfuss? I think by the time that I noticed this film on television, it was already being spoofed by networks like Nickelodeon. So my early recollections of it are of the kids sitting at the dinner table, and they're crying and scared to death in the film. But when I saw it on television, they were having their voices dubbed over in weird and silly ways for children's entertainment. Episode 47 audio. But I absolutely love how the father looks at his mashed potatoes and says, and in the creepiest way, "This means something." And then, of course, he runs out into the street and starts screaming, "What does this mean?" Fan theory. Matrix is actually a sequel to Close Encounters of the Third Kind because Switch tells Mouse aboard the Nebuchadnezzar it doesn't mean anything after Mouse is asking what it means when he sees Neo fall during his first jump with Morpheus. Such is the case here. I have to put this program to some good use without deluding myself into thinking that I'm somehow or other fighting crime, saving lives, or that my skin is actually green. Looking good at 364 and standing by to cancel out our relative velocity. The elation of getting the tank docked was quickly soured when I realized that QuickTime crashed about 2 minutes into filming and I wasn't going to be able to use revert to launch. So I had to start over with a backup file from about 10 minutes before the end of the previous flight. Fuck you, QuickTime. So we start off at about 1.6, actually closer to 1.7 kilometers. But it's kind of a good thing that I started over because the first time I jumped the gun and did the docking maneuver on the dark side of Kerbal, so it was going to look like crap anyway. And we're closing in at about 13 to 14 meters per second, and I don't remember how I got into this configuration. Anyway, details. Let's close the distance and try to do this thing with some sunlight. So ideally, I point towards the target, fire the engine a bit, and get up close to the space station just as we receive ample daylight. Point retrograde and think about how I could have just worn a microphone and done all of this voiceover as I played the game. And let there be light so that I may show off my command of the RCS thrusters. Now, even though I'm on the light side of Kerbal, I'm also on the dark side of the space station. If I could go back and do this again, I would have overshot the station a bit and approached with the sun at my back. The way I did it here nearly had me crashing into the solar panels. Velocity 0, and I'm about to do this the hard way, much like this video. Centering the velocity on the target by firing in the oblique, and we're on our way. Getting my fuel squared away so I can deorbit this thing, and of course set up for a retrograde burn. This is where I was seriously questioning my approach vector because I have the sun in my face, and yet I'm trying to make out the shadowy side of the station against the blackness of outer space. Not good. And now going over to RCS so I can tweak the velocity vector without having to turn the entire spacecraft. The station is in view, and I think I was worried about passing it, so I stopped and decided to go around the back between the station and Kerbal. Really would have been easier to just travel another 200 meters or so. Jettison the second stage, and now we're working solely with RCS. Set the opposite docking port as our target, and now we just need to stick the landing. So going back to Richard Dreyfuss studying his mashed potatoes, and somebody fact-checked that. I need to know if it actually was mashed potatoes and not stuffing or mac and cheese when he went ahead and bugged out in front of his kids. I really do hope that all of this means something, because even constructing something like this in the confines of your imagination can be quite a pain. So now I'm just trying to get around these solar panels without destroying them. And really, I must have been in a hurry or something because I could not have picked a more treacherous path across the top of the station. What does they say in the Bible? A rich man, emphasis on man because 2,000 years ago women were property, can get into heaven, but it's like passing through the eye of a needle, something like that. And oh God, why did I keep the target selected at this point? Oh well, it all works out at the end of the video somehow. Backing up, just need a beeping sound so that my second stage booster knows to get out of the way since I'm obviously not paying attention to where I'm going here. I think I was just scared of getting too far away from the station, like I might run out of fuel or something and not come back. This vehicle definitely has abandonment issues, never mind what's wrong with its pilot. And yes, I'm in a never-ending battle to determine what direction my keyboard is lined up in relative to the RCS thrusters. I'll definitely turn off targeting and just take a simple, possibly rectangular path the next time. Trying to jinx while in motion and constantly needing to tweak the controls is bad enough without wondering what part of WASD setup points where. The orientation of the prograde marker to that of the target marker indicates the direction that the target is moving relative to the spacecraft. However, in this case, the target is moving to my right even though the nav ball indicates that it should be going up or down. Now I'm sure there's a rational explanation for this, maybe the way I installed the guidance unit or something. But in this case, trial and error will get me home. No damaged solar panels, and we're now lined up on the runway, so to speak. I only recently learned about two vitally important things to efficient docking. Activating control from here on your craft's docking port, and deactivating SAS before you make contact with the target. It turns out that astronauts in real life turn off their guidance systems just before doing this because otherwise they risk having two separate systems fighting each other, and that's just not safe. I once got thrown away from a target, but not before I went crashing into some nearby solar panels. All because I did not turn off SAS. So both your velocity and the orientation of the vehicles themselves need to be physically lined up at this point. I found out after this mission that there's actually a docking mod that assists with these things, so I'll be testing that out on future missions. Definitely tweaking here. Are there any fans of Dr. Strangelove watching this? If you are, then you remember all the sexual innuendo around the refueling procedure for the B-52 bombers in the movie. I figure someone's going to eventually try to remake that film, and now that I think about it, I'm wondering if it'll be Space Force instead of the Strategic Air Command with a docking procedure as a sexual proxy. You never know. A little high, and I almost forgot to cut out SAS. Booyah. Booyah. The world may be burning, rioters could be outside my door with the pandemic raging as North Korea prepares to start World War III. But my ship just docked and that's all that matters. Hey Jeb, where's my pizza? Oh, you made Val prepare it? I'm going to admire my newest creation in all of its glory. Thanks again to Orbiter for the design. I'm going to go outside the station and stretch my legs. It took a moment for me to get a handle on flying this thing. Ultimately, I was on Google where I learned how to use the space bar to orient the Kerbal's back towards the viewer, and that's how you turn. I also had to go and look up how to go up and down, which is via the shift key and control. After that, it was a pretty mellow flight. So, if you're still here, I appreciate you hanging out during my first fuel delivery. Till next time, this is Pentagram Prime signing off. Peace.